This is an A2 economics lesson on the topic of exchange rates. We'll start with the definition. An exchange rate is the price of a nation's currency in terms of another currency. And it's best illustrated by looking at this graph. All that this graph shows is how many dollars, US dollars, you can buy with 1 pound. And you can see it sort of tracked over the past 10 years here. The pound used to buy you nearly $2 or $2.10, and then now it buys you about $1.58. And that's just the way that the currency fluctuates. This is from www.xe.com, which is a really great place to get graphs if you want to mess around with it, and they've got some really cool features that you can do. A summary from last year is you should remember that a strong pound, for example, when the pound was equal to $2.10, like it was in November 2007, it means that exports are expensive abroad, your imports are cheap, and AD will shift left, because remember, exports are things that you're selling and it helps your aggregate demand, whereas imports are things you're buying in, and so that's going to shift your aggregate demand curve left. Whereas when you have a weak pound, like it was in January 2009, where a pound bought only $1.38, your exports are cheap abroad, you sell more exports abroad, your imports are expensive, so you buy less of those, and so your AD curve will shift right. A few more terms that are worth knowing is that an exchange rate is said to be appreciating if it's getting stronger when it can buy more foreign currency per unit of domestic currency. So for example, if the pound goes from $1.60 to $1.80, we would say that it's appreciating, whereas if an exchange rate is depreciating, it's getting weaker because it can buy less of that foreign currency per unit. And so when the pound goes from $1.60 to $1.40, we would say it's depreciating. And if we look at that with the graph that we had from before, we would say that we had a really strong pound, as we said in November 2007. Through this period here, it was depreciating. And then in that little period there, in 2013, 2014, we would say that there was some appreciation of the pound. Those are just the terms that you often find people use. So the question now is, how are exchange rates determined? And the simple answer to this is they're determined on foreign exchange markets, sometimes referred to as Forex markets. I've got a picture of Canary Wharf there because London is a big financial trading center for foreign exchange. And when you think about who's buying and selling the currencies, it's people like these guys here who are just at a computer terminal at a bank, and they're just clicking buttons, buying and selling lots of currencies. Some of these currencies they're buying for firms because firms want to buy things from abroad and they need to buy the currency to be able to get that. But a lot of that currency that they're trading is actually speculation, people trying to make money off of changes in exchange rates, and we'll talk about that in a little more later on. So how does this work? Well, it's a simple supply and demand diagram. We've got to make sure we get the labels right. On the y-axis, we say exchange rate. I've said here pounds or dollars per pound, just as an example. And on the x-axis, we say quantity of currency traded. So we've got our demand. Now, demand is equal to our exports because if people want our exports, they need to have our currency, so that's part of the demand for the currency. Supply is how much of the pounds are supplied on the market, and that's roughly equal to imports, because if we're importing things and we pay for it in pounds and we put pounds onto the foreign exchange markets to be able to buy the other currencies that we want to be able to use to buy those imported goods. And what happens is we find an equilibrium where we have an exchange rate on the y-axis and we have a quantity traded on the x-axis. The quantity traded isn't as important as the exchange rate. Now, there are many different influences on exchange rates, but the things that I want to focus on most are the idea of trade and interest rates affecting exchange rates. And here are the reasons why. If we have a market for the pound sterling, like we said from before, and if we suddenly find that everybody around the world wants to buy British products, we would say that the demand for British products means that people demand British pounds, because if you want to buy a British product from a British company, you have to pay that company in pounds. And so what happens is British products are really popular, so people want to buy the pounds. The demand curve for pounds shifts outwards, and what we'll see is we'll see a new equilibrium that will help to push up the exchange rate. So we will see that more people demanding British products will see an appreciation in the exchange rate. The effect of interest rates we can use a little logic to figure this out. If the Bank of England pushes up the UK interest rates, you need to think about what's going to happen abroad. Say in America, people who are working in banks looking for a good return on their money, they see that the Bank of England has put up UK interest rates, and so these American investors want to put their money in British accounts to take advantage of the higher interest rates. They want to be able to make that return on their money. And so if they want to put their money in British accounts, they need to find pounds to be able to do that. So the demand for pounds goes up, and we'll see how that works in this graph. So the American investors want to buy the pounds to put into British banks. That shifts the demand curve right. And again, we see the appreciation of the pound sterling as a result of the Bank of England putting up interest rates. And there are three ways of saying this. I think these all basically say the same thing, but higher domestic interest rates lead to higher exchange rates. Higher domestic interest rates make the domestic exchange rate appreciate, and the pound sterling will appreciate when the Bank of England increases its interest rate. As long as one of those makes sense to you, I think you'll be fine, because really they kind of say the same thing. The opposite holds true as well. So that's to say that if the interest rate goes down in the UK, then people are probably going to sell their pounds, and that would depreciate. And here's why. So if British investors, if the interest rate goes down in the UK, British investors want to sell their pounds so they can invest in countries with higher interest rates. That means that on the foreign exchange markets, what we've got is people selling their pounds. So it's a shift right in the supply curve for pounds. This means that there's going to be a new equilibrium and a lower price in dollars for pounds. And so that's going to show that the exchange rate has depreciated. So lowering the interest rate will make a currency depreciate. Now, there are two types of exchange rate systems. There's a floating exchange rate system, which it means that a currency is only set by the foreign exchange markets through supply and demand for that particular currency. Thus, floating exchange rates change freely and are determined by trading in the Forex market. The supply and demand curves that we've seen before is basically how a foreign exchange, a floating system works. The advantages of this kind of system is that there's automatic correction in the balance of payments, free internal monetary policy, as we'll see later on, and there are no crises when managing currencies, and we'll touch on that a bit later. But if you're interested in that, you can look at some specific places in your textbook and online to go through the logic of why those things happen. The disadvantage of a floating exchange rate is that there's uncertainty, because if you don't really know what the exchange rate is going to be and you're importing things, you never know exactly how much it's going to cost you to import the goods that you need to make your product. And it also can mean that there's a lack of fiscal discipline, because if you know that you can change the exchange rate, maybe firms, they're not so careful about keeping costs down because they know that, well, the exchange rate might change anyway, and so that means that they're going to be able to sell their products abroad no matter what. Again, I think you'll want to look online for some of those things if you want to explain that a bit better.